YouTube warbles on a lot here with part 2 of global warming, what's happening now. A literary review of the Dataflow comprising of New Scientist magazine articles. We got through 5 magazines in part 1, 5 to go in part 2. 26 October 2013. The idea that we live on a planet that takes care of us is intuitively appealing, so it's no wonder that James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, that the biosphere acts like a living organism, one that self-regulates to keep conditions just right for life, became so popular. Although rooted in science, Gaia appeals to the same side of human nature that gods and guardian angels do. It's a complex hypothesis and was never going to be easy to test, but the evidence has been mounting since Lovelock put it forward 40 years ago, and now the first major review of that evidence has been conducted. The verdict: Gaia doesn't hold up. It's the great tragedy of science, the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact, so they say. But I would have thought that the uprated hypothesis of Gaia's vengeance would suggest that extreme weather events caused by greenhouse effect, caused by carbon emissions, caused by industrial deficit financed economic agriculture would mean more damage to the social infrastructure and thus a dismantling of the industrial deficit financed industry and the society and the economy that's doing the damage, and I would say Gaia will just fight back through extreme weather events. So I'd say it's not over yet. They've called it too early. As witnessed by record heat behind bushfires. We are paying the price with wildfires. So said UN Climate Chief Christina Figueres, as Australia's most populous state struggled with the worst fires for 45 years. Climate models predict that fire-friendly weather conditions will become more common in the state, but that isn't why the current fires are so ferocious, says Andy Pittman at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Instead, he says it was the result of a very warm winter, part of Australia's warmest 12 months on record, which was probably caused by climate change. Vegetation that would commonly basically shut down in winter continued to transpire, says Pittman. By continuing to give off water, the vegetation dried out the soil, so the plants also became dry. That primed the landscape for fire. Gaia's revenge, see? However, Toby Tyrrell is a professor of Earth System Science at the University of Southampton, UK. He researches ocean acidification, marine biochemistry and more generally how life and environment interact on Earth. His book On Gaia, A Critical Investigation of the Relationship Between Life and Earth, was published this year by Princeton University Press. Lovelock's books and articles propose 3 main arguments for Gaia. 1, that Earth is an extremely favourable habitat for life. Toby Tyrrell disagrees with that. 2, that life has greatly altered the planetary environment, including the chemical composition of the atmosphere and the sea. He agrees that that's technically correct, but he says it's a really minor effect and he doesn't think it's very significant. 3, that the Earth's environment has remained fairly stable over geological time. He disagrees with that, citing ice ages. And he concludes, my research led to a clear outcome, that the Gaia hypothesis is not an accurate picture of how our world works. Unfortunately, our planet is less robustly stabilised than Gaia implies, and therefore more fragile. In some ways, it is a shame that this beautiful idea doesn't hold true, but it is far better that we tackle environmental issues based on an accurate view of how our Earth system operates, rather than a flawed one. Well, I'm still hoping that Gaia's revenge can tell the difference between someone who's trying to do the right thing and someone who doesn't care about damage to the environment. 2nd of November. Climate fixes need testing. You might think that giving people free rein to experiment with technologies that could cool the planet is a recipe for chaos, but as things stand, pretty much anyone could carry out field tests at will. Most geoengineering exists in a legal void. See page 14. But before we get there, Africa's green energy hub. Ethiopia's green economy is booming. Ashagoda wind farm will generate 120 megawatts of electricity. It came online just days after Ethiopia announced a preliminary agreement to build a 1,000 megawatt geothermal facility, the largest in Africa. The real challenge will be delivering that power to its people. According to the International Energy Agency, 77% of Ethiopians don't have access to electricity. Most of its power will be sold to neighbouring countries. Meanwhile, emission admission. Talk about a wrong turn. New Zealand's carbon emissions are set to be 3 times as high as its target, despite the country having an emissions trading scheme. The government wants to cut emissions to half of 1990 levels by 2050, but projections it released last week show that they are likely to be 50% higher than 1990 levels by 2040. New Zealand doesn't have a long-term vision about how it's going to get its emissions down. Oopsie. As suggested on page 14, geoengineers can legally hack the climate. The latest report from the UN IPCC includes geoengineering, a sure sign that the idea has become respectable. But research and field trials are needed before we know whether influencing the climate like this is a viable option for cooling the Earth. This is easier said than done. To find out the legal status of such trials, Jesse Reynolds went through the fine print of 15 major environmental treaties, including the CBD, the LPC, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. He found that apart from the LCP's ruling on dumping material into the sea, which is legally binding, the language of the other treaties actually permits field tests. The CBD statement, for example, merely, quote, invites, unquote, governments to ensure no geoengineering activities take place, rather than making it a legal requirement to do so. The fallback position is that countries are free to do more or less what they want. The ambiguous legal situation needs clearing up. I can agree with that. Meanwhile, burn and crash. If you thought the financial crisis was bad, wait till you see what's coming down the pipe from the fossil fuel industry, says Jeremy Leggett. As a result of their complacency, we face 4 great risks. The first and biggest is no surprise, climate change. We have way more unburned conventional fossil fuel than is needed to wreck the climate. Yet much of the energy industry is discovering and developing unconventional deposits, shale gas and tar sands, for example, to pile onto the fire, while simultaneously abandoning solar power just as it begins to look promising. It has been vaguely terrifying to watch how CEOs of the big energy companies square that circle. Second, we risk creating a carbon bubble in the capital markets. If policymakers are to achieve their goal of limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, 60 to 80% of proved reserves of fossil fuels will have to remain in the ground unburned. If so, the value of oil and gas companies would crash and a lot of people would lose a lot of money. Third, we risk being surprised by the boom in shale gas production. That, too, may prove to be a bubble. Production from individual shale wells declines rapidly, and large amounts of capital then have to be borrowed to drill replacements. This will surprise many people who make judgment calls based on the received wisdom that limits to shale drilling are few. Fourth, we court disaster with assumptions about oil depletion. Most of us believe the industry mantra that there will be adequate flows of just about affordable oils for decades to come. Crude production peaked in 2005 and oil fields are depleting at more than 6% per year. The much-hyped 2 million barrels a day of new US production capacity from shale needs to be put in context. We live in a world that consumes 90 million barrels of oil a day. So far, we have found ways to collectively bury our heads in the sand in the face of dire scientific warnings. If we fail to heed the report and all of its implications, the next great crisis of capitalism will force us to act. It won't be possible to ignore lights that go out and tankers that fail to arrive. 9 November. Even had a bit of good news on the front cover. A global climate pact might be unnecessary after all. We haven't fixed global warming, but new evidence suggests that the world has taken its foot off the gas when it comes to carbon dioxide emissions. In 2012, the growth in emissions was 1.1% compared with an average of 2.9% since 2000. Perhaps more importantly, the rise was less than a third of the 3.5% growth in global GDP. See page 6. This means that economic growth is finally starting to be, quote, decoupled from emissions. The leap has largely been achieved by incremental local initiatives. Individual choices such as switching light bulbs are an important factor. This growing trend is seen more and more in major countries, most notably China, the world's largest emitter. It is an affirmation of what economists call the environmental Kuznets curve. It also reflects the fact that even without a global deal on fighting climate change, 2/3 of the world now operates under some kind of law or strategy for limiting national emissions, Plan B, if you will. This unilateralism broke out at the Cancun climate talks 3 years ago. Much of the remarkable US volte-face on emissions is due to cheap shale gas, not renewable energy sources. And to curtail warming at below 2 degrees, we need more than a flatlining of emissions. We need cuts in excess of 2% a year until mid-century. But what the 2012 figures show is that we can cut emissions without tearing up the world as we know it. We don't have to abandon economic growth or make hair-shirt sacrifices. The good news is that, while a global deal would clearly be a good thing, we could be on the way to saving the planet without it. Yay team, let's hope. On the next page, while the aerospace industry fantasises about burning fossil fuel to get to Mach 6, IPCC draft leaked. There is no respite. Left unabated, climate change will cause global shortages of food and water and drive people into deeper poverty, according to a leaked draft of the next IPCC report on the societal impacts of climate change. Unless farming practices change, local temperature increases of more than about 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial values, a threshold many areas are close to, will cut yields of the major crops. Those hardest hit by climate change will be the poor and vulnerable, and states that will also, quote, create new poor. The worst effects are expected to be in cities and rural areas of sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. By exacerbating poverty, climate change may also increase the risk of violent conflict. While many countries and regions are beginning to adapt to climate change, for instance improving sea defences, the world as a whole is not doing enough. The summary finds that the costs of adaptation are substantially greater than the funding currently set aside both for now and the future. Mach 6, eh? A new course for global emissions. Humanity's carbon dioxide emissions are still climbing, but there are finally signs of a slowdown. 2012 may go down in history as a remarkable year. For the first time, the maddening pace of humanity's greenhouse gas emissions showed signs of a global slowdown. Importantly, the let-off is happening at the same time as global wealth continues to swell. Yippee! To avoid more than 2 degrees Celsius of climate change, the target agreed in the 2009 talks, global emissions need to drop fast. This signals a shift toward less fossil fuel intensive activities, more use of renewable energy and increased energy savings. Importantly, the emissions rise is considerably less than the increase in global GDP of 3.5%. We see a decoupling of CO2 emissions from global economic growth. The three biggest emitters, China, the US and the European Union, which account for more than half global emissions, all show this decoupling effect. This is the United States. The grey line is carbon dioxide emissions, the brown line is GDP. The most dramatic drop was in the US, which cut emissions by 4% last year despite its economy growing by 2.8%. US emissions are now 12% below their 2007 peak and back to levels of 2 decades ago. The US Energy Information Administration confirms. It says a big switch from coal to shale gas in 2012 was accompanied by a 5% reduction in the energy needed to create each dollar of wealth. These are very positive signs. Decoupling is definitely happening. We're seeing it in a lot of the world. What is behind the slowdown? In most countries, the biggest factors are measures to boost energy efficiency, according to the International Energy Agency. This includes everything from fuel savings in factories to more fuel-efficient trucks and the adoption of low-energy light bulbs. So you'd think that anybody with enough intelligence to pour sand out of a boot with instructions printed on the bottom of the heel would have already fitted a sunfoil or streamlined solar panel to their road vehicle. Is it not so? And cutting coal out of the mix is vital. The EU has shown for 10 years that economic growth is possible with declining emissions, or through energy efficiency and renewable energy, he says. China's progress also looks promising, he adds, though it's less clear, that's China there on the right, although it's less clear whether the US change is part of a long-term trend. Other industrialised nations, however, met their Kyoto Protocol target to cut their overall emissions by 4.2% between 1990 and 2012. That's good. There's still a long way to go. Some big emitters like India and Japan don't fit in with a trend for decoupling of GDP and emissions. In 1992, governments at the Earth Summit promised to prevent, quote, dangerous climate change, now taken to mean anything over 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. According to the latest assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to achieve this target we must keep cumulative emissions since the Industrial Revolution below 1 trillion tonnes of carbon. That means emissions must be cut by 2.5% each year starting now. Breaking the link between emissions and GDP is a start. It's just a pity that the Australian Environment Minister has announced that limiting temperature rise to below 2 degrees was an aspirational goal rather than a hard commitment. 16 November. Regarding the mega typhoon in the Philippines, there will be many more natural disasters like the typhoon that hit the Philippines last week. As global climate change negotiations began again on Monday, the Philippines' chief negotiator Yeb Sano made a tearful speech begging the rest of the world to take firm action on the issue. Just days before, Typhoon Haiyan devastated his family's home city Tacloban. He made a similarly emotional speech during the previous round of negotiations last year after Typhoon Bopha struck his country. Despite Sano's passion, it's unlikely that much will happen at this year's talks. The world's governments are aiming to sign a global deal in 2015, and the meeting this week in Warsaw, Poland, is only a stepping stone towards that. What's more, Australia's new government is planning to abandon the country's carbon pricing system, demolishing one of the world's flagship projects to tackle climate change. And the country plans to throw out its commitment to reducing emissions by between 5% and 25% of 2000 levels by 2020. Just one major thing is supposed to happen in Warsaw, the details of a mechanism to address loss and damage from climate change. That means if a country suffers harm from climate change that it had not been able to adapt to, for instance, from an extremely severe typhoon, other countries would be obliged to help in some way. So, Australia emits 4.5% of carbon emissions to the atmosphere via our coal and gas exports. We should be stuck with 4.5% of the damage and the rebuilding in the Philippines. It would be fair. We made the profit of selling the carbon. Aftermath of a typhoon, one of the fiercest storms ever recorded to hit land. The Philippines is no stranger to heavy weather. It is the third most disaster-hit country in the world, exceeded only by China and the US. Most of its disasters are storms or floods. And it's getting worse. We've had an unusually large number of tropical cyclones this year. The average is 19 or 20, this year 25 made landfall. What's more, weather patterns are changing and sea levels are rising. An unfortunate interplay between Typhoon Haiyan's power and direction and a landscape that funnelled a 5-metre high storm surge straight at the city of Tacloban spelled disaster last week. The sea level has risen 30 centimetres in the Philippines over the past 60 years. Compare that with a global average of 19 centimetres since 1901. According to the latest report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, changes in wind patterns over the tropical Pacific are playing a key role in driving up local sea levels. They appear to be piling up water in the western Pacific, exacerbating global sea level rise due to expanding warmer oceans and melting ice sheets. Higher sea levels may have worsened the impact of Typhoon Haiyan. Indeed, climate scientists have been warning for some years that rising sea levels pile more water into storm surges, causing them to wreak more damage on coastal regions. For example, coastal flooding caused by Superstorm Sandy in 2012 is thought to have been made worse by the rises in sea levels around Lower Manhattan. But climate uncertainty is a reality, so that what we learned from Haiyan may only serve as a guide. Get off the carbon train or we're all stuffed. It's all downhill from here. Right now, Earth's climate is not warming too much when extra carbon dioxide reaches the atmosphere. But as levels of the gas keep rising, the climate will become ever more sensitive to it. That means emissions in 2100 could be even more dangerous than emissions today. Despite decades of research, nobody is really sure how sensitive the climate is to carbon dioxide. Our best guess, according to the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, is that doubling the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere would raise global temperatures between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius, but there is no consensus on this climate sensitivity. To estimate how much the sensitivity varies, Gary Russell of NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies ran a climate model repeatedly. Each run of the model kicked off with a different concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. In each case, they ran the model for 100 years to see how much the world warmed as CO2 levels increased. The model had a fairly high climate sensitivity to begin with a predicted warming of 5.15 degrees Celsius. As Russell kept doubling the CO2, the model responded even more. For each doubling, from 8 times to 32 times the initial concentration, the temperature rose by 8 degrees Celsius as the clouds moved higher into the sky, trapping ever more heat. We think climate sensitivity will be greater in 2100 than it was in 2000, says Russell. At the moment, we're on a path to a doubling of CO2, and over the next 50 to 100 years we could see a quadrupling. That means if we keep burning fossil fuels, the warming could start accelerating, which is a worry. And to give you an idea of the scale we're working on, you can see Western Australia is lit up better than Eastern Australia because they've probably gone to bed. You can see the cyclone over the Philippines. Some of the lights are still on. Indonesia's pretty brightly lit. Southeast Asia's pretty brightly lit. China and Japan are pretty brightly lit. Not too many lights in Burma and Bangladesh. India's lit up like a Christmas tree. The Middle East is lit up pretty well. Africa's still in sunlight. Imagine how much coal and oil and gas are burning to turn the generators, to make the electricity, to run all those lights. No wonder this is called the Angry Earth. 23 November. Unexpected tornadoes. This wasn't supposed to happen. Why are tornadoes in the US increasingly popping up at unusual times of the year and in unusual areas? The 3 largest twister outbreaks in the past year have been in November, January and October, outside the usual mid-year tornado season. But what was really remarkable about the outbreak was how far north it extended. Because these types of severe events during cold seasons are still relatively rare, it's difficult to say anything definitive about how they're being affected by climate change, but one would expect to see them become increasingly common further north in a warming climate. Climate frustration. Japan downgraded its 2020 target for emissions cuts from 25% below 2005 levels to 3.8% below. Brazil blamed criminals for the increase in deforestation in the Amazon last year after almost a decade of decline, and the Polish hosts were pilloried for their ongoing support of coal. And they abandoned talks of how to cut emissions from agriculture, the sector responsible for 30% of the global total. But turd of the week was Tony Abbott. Carbon bad boy. 60,000 Australians took to the streets this week to protest actions that have cemented the nation's status as a climate bad boy. The Conservative government elected in September has moved to rip up most of the country's carbon reduction measures. Now at the UN climate talks in Warsaw, see climate frustration left, the Australian delegation, which notably lacked a government minister, has taken a hard-line approach, drawing firm boundaries it will not cross. For example, it has refused to consider mandatory financing arrangements through which wealthy countries help fund mitigation and adaptation in developing ones, a key pillar of the UN framework. The delegation said that the lion's share of the money must come from the private sector because climate financing shouldn't be welfare. Of the world's 61 biggest emitters, Australia is now ranked by non-governmental organisation German Watch as the 5th worst in the world in terms of its efforts to protect the world's climate. The country has also received 4, quote, Fossil of the Day, unquote, awards at the Warsaw talks given by NGOs to uncooperative countries. And the story about needing 1.5 Earths to sustain current consumption rates, it's all bullshit. The entire land overshoot is human emissions of carbon converted into a proxy measure of land area. Overshoot is the combination of all our demands meeting limited biocapacity. So, climate science denialists and global warming doubters, that's 10 weeks of what I've read in New Scientist. Cost me $85 to buy the magazines so I could get my head around it and try and explain it to you. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. Ciao. Woof, that wasn't very smooth. Try again. Ciao.